This 4-year-old beggar girl holds a dead doll and says he was my only friend. When he hears this, the millionaire does something that shocks everyone. Comment what you think will happen. Your opinion is very important. And subscribe to my channel to support my work. Your help is very important. The muffled cry sliced through the crisp afternoon air like a knife, echoing between the century-old walls of the First Presbyterian Church in Oakhaven. Richard Sterling, 52, stopped abruptly on the cobblestone sidewalk, his firm strides as a successful businessman faltering. He had just left a meeting at the Chamber of Commerce, discussing once again the impressive numbers of his textile company, when that sound hit him like a punch to the gut. It was a different kind of cry, not the typical tantrum of a disgruntled child, but something deeper, more desperate. A sound that carried a loneliness that he, even in his darkest moments after building his empire, had never experienced. Following the sound, Richard rounded the imposing Gothic revival church that dominated the town centre. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the gravel that surrounded the back garden, where old headstones told stories of settlers who, like his ancestors, had sought a new life in the American heartland. That's when he saw her. Huddled against the stone wall that separated the cemetery from the town square, a girl of approximately 6 years old held against her chest a rag doll so battered that it was difficult to distinguish its original form. Her clothes, which one day must have been a light blue dress, were now a jumble of dirty and torn fabrics. Her blonde hair, common in the area, was tangled and dull. "He was my only friend," she whispered to the doll, tears streaming down her thin, pale face. "Now you're hurt too." Richard felt something break inside his chest. In 5 decades of life, building a textile empire that employed half the town, facing economic crises and competing with industry giants, he had never felt so touched by anything. The child hadn't even noticed his presence, completely absorbed in her silent conversation with the tattered toy. The girl lifted the doll to eye level, and Richard could see that one of the doll's legs was almost detaching, held only by a few stubborn threads. "You can't break two," she murmured, her small voice carrying a despair that cut the businessman's heart. "You're all I have." Richard took a step forward, deliberately stepping on a dry leaf to announce his presence. The girl looked up, and he saw huge, frightened blue eyes that seemed to have seen too much for such a small child. "Hi," he said softly, crouching down to her level. "My name is Richard. What's yours?" The girl hugged the doll tighter, retreating until her back touched the stone wall. "Lily," she whispered after a long moment. "Lily, what a pretty name." Richard observed the child's bare feet, cut and dirty. "You're hurt." "It doesn't matter," she replied, lowering her eyes. "Nobody cares anyway." The simple sentence hit Richard like a lightning bolt. At that moment, looking at that abandoned child in her absolute loneliness, he made a decision that would change not only his life, but that of his entire family. "Want to come home with me?" he asked, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "I can take care of you." Lily studied him with those big eyes, searching for signs of lies or danger. Finally she nodded, almost imperceptibly. When Richard extended his hand, she hesitated for a moment before taking it, and together they walked through the cobblestone streets of Oakhaven towards the Sterling mansion. They had no idea that this chance encounter would trigger a sequence of events that would shake the foundations of one of the town's most respected families, revealing secrets that had been carefully buried for years and testing the limits of love, loyalty, and human redemption. In the majestic Victorian house that dominated the highest hill in town, Eleanor Sterling, 48, was preparing to receive the ladies of the charity club when she heard her husband's footsteps on the porch. Looking through the living room window, she froze as she saw Richard walking up the steps, hand in hand with a ragged child. Her face, always perfectly composed for local society, twisted into an expression of horror and fury that revealed the true nature behind her impeccable social mask. Eleanor descended the stairs with the calculated elegance of someone who had spent decades perfecting every movement to impress Oakhaven's high society. Her heels echoed on the imported marble of the entrance hall like war drums, and when she reached the front door, her expression had already transformed into the icy smile she reserved for situations she considered unacceptable. "Richard, dear," she said, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "What an interesting surprise." Lily hid behind Richard's legs, clutching the rag doll to her chest. The contrast between the imposing mansion, with its crystal chandeliers and antique furniture, and her ragged appearance was glaring. "Eleanor, this is Lily," Richard said, placing a protective hand on the girl's shoulder. "She's going to stay with us." The silence that followed was tense enough to cut with a knife. Eleanor observed the child as if she were a stain on her Persian rug, her blue eyes quickly calculating the social implications of the situation. "Naturally," she replied finally, her voice betraying no emotion. "I'll prepare suitable accommodations." Richard had known his wife long enough to recognize the danger behind that apparent calm. Eleanor Sterling did nothing without a purpose, and her immediate agreement could only mean that she was already planning how to deal with this situation in order to maintain her reputation intact. "Thank you," he said, not really believing the ease with which she had accepted. "Lily, how about a hot bath and something to eat?" The girl nodded timidly, her big eyes scanning the luxurious details of the house. She had never been in a place like this. Each object seemed to be worth more money than she could imagine. Eleanor led them through the main hallway, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the polished wood of the banister. "Martha," she called, her voice echoing through the house, "prepare the guest room and find some suitable clothes." Martha Johnson, the housekeeper who had worked for the family for 15 years, appeared quickly, her kind eyes filling with compassion when she saw Lily. Unlike her employer, Martha had grown up in poverty and immediately recognized the signs of a child who had been through hardship. "Of course, ma'am," Martha replied, reaching out to Lily. "Come with me, little one. We'll take care of you." Lily looked at Richard, seeking confirmation. When he nodded encouragingly, she followed Martha up the stairs, still clinging to her battered doll. As soon as they were alone, Eleanor's mask fell completely. "Have you lost your mind?" she hissed, her eyes flashing with contained fury. "Brought a beggar into our house? Do you have any idea what people will think?" "A child, Eleanor," Richard corrected, his voice firm. "A child who needed help. A child who will destroy our reputation," she exploded, momentarily losing control. 30 years building our position in this town, and you want to throw it all away for a street urchin?" Richard studied her as if he were seeing her for the first time. There was something in Eleanor's reaction that went beyond normal social concern. It was almost fear. "Ethan is arriving tomorrow from Yale," she continued, recomposing herself. "Imagine his reaction when he finds out you've decided to adopt a child without even consulting me." "I'm not adopting anyone," Richard said, although the words sounded strange even to him. "I just offered temporary shelter." Eleanor laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Nothing is temporary with you, Richard. You've always been too sentimental for your own good." At that moment, Martha came down the stairs carrying Lily's dirty clothes. "Mr. Sterling," she said hesitantly. "The girl. She was asking if you were really going to let her stay." "Of course I am," he replied without hesitation, ignoring Eleanor's murderous glare. "She also said she hasn't eaten anything in 2 days," Martha added, her voice filled with maternal indignation. Eleanor sighed dramatically. "Very well, but this situation needs to be handled with absolute discretion. I don't want half of Oakhaven coming here asking awkward questions." "What kind of questions?" Richard asked, a suspicion growing in his mind. "About where you found the child, obviously," Eleanor replied quickly. "People have dirty minds, Richard. A single man would be one thing, but a married man bringing an unknown child home. Well, you understand. Richard felt the blood rise to his face. Are you insinuating that— I'm not insinuating anything, Eleanor interrupted. I'm just being practical about how the local society might interpret your humanitarian impulses. An hour later, Lily came down the stairs completely transformed. Martha had found a simple but clean dress that, although too large, made her look like a normal child. Her hair, now washed and combed, shone like light gold. But she was still carrying the rag doll, now slightly less dirty, but equally battered. "Feeling better?" Richard asked, his heart warming at the difference that basic care had made. "Yes, sir," Lily replied formally, her eyes lowered. "You don't have to call me sir," he said gently. "Richard is fine." Eleanor watched the interaction with calculating eyes. "Lily, isn't it?" she said, her voice assuming a falsely maternal tone. "What an interesting doll. How long have you had it?" Lily hugged the toy tighter. "Always," she whispered. "Always," Eleanor insisted. "Do you remember when you got it?" The girl shook her head, confused. He's always been with me. My mother—" "Your mother?" Eleanor leaned forward, suddenly interested. "Do you remember your mother?" "Eleanor," Richard warned, noticing Lily's growing discomfort. "Just maternal curiosity," his wife replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The girl obviously has a story, doesn't she?" Lily began to tremble slightly, her memories clearly too painful to be explored at that moment. "Enough," Richard said firmly. "Lily, how about we have dinner?" Martha prepared her specialty. But as they headed to the dining room, Richard couldn't help but notice that Eleanor continued to observe Lily with an intensity that disturbed him deeply. There was something predatory in her gaze, as if the girl represented not just a social inconvenience, but a real threat. And for the first time in his 25 years of marriage, Richard began to wonder if he really knew the woman with whom he shared his life. The arrival of Ethan Sterling the next day brought a different energy to the mansion. At 24, the heir to the family fortune carried the weight of paternal expectations and the typical rebelliousness of someone who had never had to fight for anything in life. His tousled brown hair and unshaven face contrasted with the expensive suit he wore, creating an image of careless elegance that he had cultivated during his college years at Yale. "Dad!" he shouted as he entered, throwing his luggage into the marble hall with the casual disdain of someone who had grown up surrounded by luxury. "You won't believe what happened at—" His words died when he saw Lily in the living room, sitting in an armchair that seemed to swallow her, silently drawing on a piece of paper that Martha had given her. The girl looked up, studying the newcomer with cautious curiosity. "Who's this?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with surprise and something that sounded dangerously close to irritation. "This is Lily," Richard said, carefully observing his son's reaction. "She's staying with us." Ethan looked from his father to the child, then to Eleanor, who was watching the scene with a satisfied smile on her lips. She clearly expected her son's reaction to validate her own objections to Lily's presence. "Staying with us?" Ethan repeated slowly. "What do you mean, staying with us?" "Your father decided to become a philanthropist," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "He found this girl on the street and thought it would be a good idea to bring her home." Ethan approached Lily, who instinctively shrank into the armchair. He noticed the rag doll in her lap, so battered it looked like it had been through a war. "And what are you drawing?" he asked, his voice losing some of its initial hostility. Lily shyly showed the paper. It was a surprisingly detailed drawing for a 6-year-old. It showed a young woman with long hair, smiling and holding something that looked like a baby. "It's my mother," she murmured. "At least, I think it is." "You think?" Ethan crouched beside the armchair, genuinely intrigued. "Aren't you sure?" "Memories get fuzzy sometimes," Lily explained, her words carrying a sadness too deep for her age. "But when I draw, they get clearer." Richard watched the interaction with growing emotion. There was something in Ethan's expression, a gentleness he rarely showed that suggested that perhaps his son was not as selfish as he seemed. "Can I see more drawings?" Ethan asked. Lily hesitated, then took a small pile of papers that she had hidden under the cushion. They were all drawings of the same woman, but in different situations, sometimes singing, sometimes sewing, always with a gentle smile. "Did she sing to you?" Ethan asked, studying one of the drawings that showed the woman with her mouth open, as if she were in the middle of a song. "She did," Lily confirmed, her voice becoming more animated. "A song about bluebirds. I still remember the melody." "How interesting," murmured Eleanor, approaching with renewed interest. "And do you remember anything else? Where did you live? Other relatives?" Richard noticed that Eleanor's expression had changed completely. The cold hostility had been replaced by something more calculating, almost urgent. "Sometimes I dream about a place with lots of noisy machines," Lily said, frowning with the effort of remembering. "And it smelled like new fabric." Eleanor paled visibly. "Sewing machines?" she asked, her voice slightly strained. "Eleanor?" Richard said, noticing the sudden change in his wife's behavior. "Are you all right?" "Perfectly," she replied quickly, recomposing herself. "Just wondering where the girl might have lived before." But Ethan had noticed his mother's strange reaction and continued asking questions. "Lily, do you remember your mother's name?" The girl shook her head sadly. "I called her Mommy, but sometimes I heard other people call her Valerie, suggested Ethan, watching his mother's reaction closely. "Yes," exclaimed Lily, her eyes lighting up. "Valerie, how did you know?" "Just a guess," Ethan lied, but his eyes were fixed on Eleanor, who had become as stiff as a statue. "I don't think it's productive to keep digging up painful memories," Eleanor interrupted sharply. "The girl has obviously been through trauma. It would be better to leave the past where it is." "But if we could find her family," Richard began. "Family?" Eleanor laughed, but the sound was forced. "If she had family, she wouldn't be living on the street, would she?" Lily lowered her eyes, the momentary joy of remembering her mother's name being replaced by familiar sadness. "She's gone," she whispered. "One day she was there, the next. She wasn't anymore." "Gone how?" Ethan insisted, ignoring his mother's warning glances. "I don't know," said Lily, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "The people at the foster home said she didn't want to take care of me anymore. That I was too difficult." Richard felt a growing fury in his chest. "That's a lie," he said firmly. "No mother abandons a child because she's difficult." "Richard," Eleanor warned, "you don't know anything about the situation." "And you do?" he asked, turning to face her. "You seem very interested in the details." "Just natural concern," Eleanor replied, but her voice sounded false, even to herself. At that moment, Martha entered the room carrying a tray with tea and cookies. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but there are some ladies at the door wanting to speak to Mrs. Sterling." "Which ladies?" Eleanor asked, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "From the Charity League," Martha replied. "They said it was urgent." Eleanor sighed dramatically. "Great, just what I needed." She turned to Richard. "I hope you keep this situation discreet until I get back." After Eleanor left, an awkward silence filled the room. Ethan continued studying Lily's drawings, his expression thoughtful. "Dad," he said finally, "did you ever know someone named Valerie?" Richard frowned. "The name sounds familiar. Why?" Mom's reaction when Lily mentioned the name. It was weird. "Everything about your mother's reaction has been weird since I brought Lily home," Richard admitted. Lily watched them with growing interest. "Do you think she knows my mom?" "I don't know, sweetie," Richard said gently. "But we're going to find out." Outside, through the living room window, they could see Eleanor talking animatedly with 3 well-dressed women. Her gestures were dramatic, and she continually pointed in the direction of the house. "I bet she's telling them about me," Lily said sadly. "So what if she is?" said Ethan, surprising both the girl and his father. "Maybe it's time some people in this town found out that there are kids who need help." It was the first time Ethan had defended Lily openly, and Richard felt a flash of pride for his son. But his satisfaction was interrupted when he saw one of the women outside take out a cell phone and start dialing, her eyes fixed on the window where they were standing. Something about the determined expression on the woman's face made Richard's stomach clench. Whatever Eleanor had told them, it had set a gear in motion that he suspected he wouldn't be able to stop. The phone call lasted only 3 minutes, but it was enough to change everything. Richard watched through the window as the woman gestured animatedly, her eyes occasionally turning to the house with an intensity that made him feel a chill down his spine. "Dad," said Ethan, noticing the growing tension, "what do you think is going on out there?" "Nothing good," Richard murmured, seeing Eleanor nod in agreement with something the woman was saying. Lily had stopped drawing and was watching the two men with big, worried eyes. "Are they going to take me away?" she asked, her voice small and scared. "No one's going to take you anywhere," Richard said firmly, but internally he wasn't so sure. In Oakhaven, the opinion of the established families carried almost legal weight, especially when it came to issues involving morality and social order. The women finally dispersed, but not before one of them discreetly pointed at the house and wrote something in a small notebook. Eleanor returned inside with an expression that mixed satisfaction and something that looked like anticipated triumph. "Well," she said, smoothing her skirt with precise movements, "it seems our particular situation is already public knowledge." "What does that mean?" Richard asked, although he suspected he wouldn't like the answer. "It means, my dear husband, that several very respected people in this community are concerned about the welfare of a child who has mysteriously appeared in our house." Eleanor smiled, but there was venom behind the expression. "They want to make sure everything is being done properly." "Properly according to whom?" Ethan questioned, his voice filled with irritation. "According to the appropriate authorities," Eleanor replied calmly. "Deborah Johnson from Child Protective Services will be here tomorrow for a visit." The name hit Richard like a hammer. Deborah Johnson was known throughout the county for her relentless efficiency and her natural distrust of wealthy families who suddenly developed social consciences. If she was coming to investigate, it was because someone had planted serious doubts about their motivations. "You called her." It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. "I didn't call anyone," Eleanor lied smoothly, "but when concerned citizens bring certain irregularities to my attention, I have a moral obligation to ensure that everything is transparent." Lily shrank into the armchair, instinctively understanding that she was at the center of a storm she didn't fully understand. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked, tears beginning to form. "No, honey," Richard said quickly, crouching beside her. "You didn't do anything wrong." "Then why are people mad at me?" The innocent question cut Richard's heart. "They're not mad at you, they're confused about some things." "Confused is a delicate way of putting it," Eleanor commented. "Richard, you need to understand that bringing an unknown child home raises legitimate questions. Where did she come from? Why was she alone? Where are her biological parents?" "Questions that we could have resolved as a family," said Ethan, surprising everyone with his implicit defense of Lily. "Family?" Eleanor laughed coldly. "Ethan, darling, you've barely arrived. You don't know anything about this situation. I know enough to realize that you're sabotaging any chance of resolving this calmly." The son's direct accusation left Eleanor momentarily speechless. But she quickly recomposed herself, assuming the role of the wounded mother. "I'm protecting this family," she said, her voice trembling with calculated indignation. "While you two play at being saviors, I'm dealing with the real consequences. Do you have any idea what Harold Peterson said when he saw me at the club today?" Harold Peterson was the patriarch of one of Oakhaven's oldest families, a man whose opinion could open or close business doors throughout the region. "I don't want to know," Richard said, but Eleanor continued mercilessly. "He said he hoped we knew what we were doing and that certain actions could have unforeseen consequences for family businesses." She paused dramatically. "That's not a veiled threat, Richard. It's a promise." The silence that followed was heavy. Richard had known Harold Peterson for decades, had done business with the family, built commercial alliances. If the Petersons were turning against him— "Dad," said Ethan quietly, "you can't let them blackmail you." "It's not blackmail," Eleanor corrected. "It's social reality. This town has rules, traditions. You can't just ignore them because you decided to have a fit of conscience." "Fit of conscience?" Richard repeated, his voice dangerously low. "Is that how you see helping a child in need?" "I see it as a middle-aged man making an impulsive emotional decision that could destroy everything we've built." Lily began to cry silently, the rag doll clutched against her chest. The conflict around her was too intense, too similar to the argument she vaguely remembered from before the foster home. "Stop," said Ethan firmly, pointing at Lily. "You're scaring her." But Eleanor was lost in her own anger. "And another thing, Richard. Have you thought about checking if this child has any health problems, diseases she could transmit, mental disorders? You brought her into our house without any medical verification." "Enough!" Richard exploded, his patience finally exhausted. "Lily is a child, not a dangerous animal." "She's a child you found living on the street without explanation," Eleanor retorted. "Children don't just appear out of nowhere, Richard. There's always a reason why they're alone, and they're not always reasons you want to discover." At that moment, Martha appeared at the door, clearly uncomfortable with the heated discussion. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly, "but little Lily didn't eat almost anything at lunch. Can I prepare something special for her?" "Of course, Martha," Richard said, grateful for the interruption. "And maybe," Martha continued bravely, "she could draw in the kitchen with me, away from the noise." Lily looked at Richard, seeking permission. When he nodded, she got up quickly, eager to escape the tension in the room. "Thank you," she whispered to Martha, following the housekeeper out. As soon as they were alone, Eleanor assumed a more calculating tone. "Richard, be practical. You have a company to run, a reputation to maintain. You can't let sentimentality destroy all that. What if I can prove that my intentions are pure, that I'm really helping Lily?" "How?" she asked, but there was something cautious in her voice. "By properly investigating her past, finding answers to these questions that you and the others are asking." Ethan watched his mother's expression change subtly. For a moment she seemed almost alarmed. "Investigating could bring complications you don't expect," she said carefully. "What kind of complications?" Richard asked. "Sometimes," Eleanor said, choosing her words carefully, "it's better to leave the past alone, especially when it involves children who may have traumatic histories." But Ethan had noticed something in his mother's reaction. "Mom," he said slowly, "you're acting like you know something specific about Lily." "I don't know anything specific," she replied quickly. "Just general precautions." At that moment the phone rang. Richard answered, and the voice on the other end made him pale. "Mr. Sterling, this is Deborah Johnson. I need to schedule a visit for tomorrow morning. I've received some concerning information about a child at your residence." "What kind of information?" Richard asked, his eyes fixed on Eleanor. "I'd prefer to discuss it in person. Would 9 o'clock be convenient?" "Yes," Richard said, although every instinct screamed that it wouldn't be convenient at all. When he hung up, he found Eleanor smiling with poorly disguised satisfaction. "Well," she said, "now you'll have your chance to prove your noble intentions. I hope you're prepared for the questions she's going to ask." But as night fell over Oakhaven, Richard began to suspect that Deborah Johnson's questions would be much more specific and dangerous than he imagined. Deborah Johnson arrived promptly at 9 o'clock the next morning, driving a small official car that contrasted sharply with the luxurious vehicles typical of visitors to the Sterling mansion. At 35, She had the look of someone who had seen enough of human nature not to be easily impressed by wealth or social status. Richard greeted her at the door, immediately noticing how she catalogued every detail of the house with trained professional eyes. Deborah wore a simple but well-cut suit, her brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, and carried a worn leather briefcase that suggested years of field work. "Mr. Sterling," she said, shaking his hand firmly, "thank you for seeing me. I know this situation must be delicate. Please come in," Richard replied, leading her to the living room where Eleanor awaited them with her best performance of a concerned hostess. "Ms. Johnson," Deborah greeted, accepting the offered chair but maintaining an alert posture. "I imagine you're wondering exactly why I'm here." "Naturally," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with maternal concern. "When it comes to the well-being of a child, any investigation is welcome." Deborah opened her briefcase and took out a small recorder. "Do you mind if I record our conversation? It's standard procedure for cases involving minors in irregular situations." "Irregular situations," Richard repeated, a coldness growing in his stomach. "A child of apparent age between 5 and 7 years, without documentation, found in unspecified circumstances, living with a family without a legal process of adoption or temporary guardianship." Deborah enumerated the points with clinical precision. "That falls into several categories of irregularity according to the state's child welfare statutes." "We found her abandoned," Richard explained. "I offered temporary shelter while we try to resolve the situation properly." "Where exactly did you find her?" "Behind the First Presbyterian Church, downtown." Deborah made notes. "What time? Were there any witnesses?" "Around 5 in the afternoon." "No, none that I saw." Witness. Richard began to feel as if he were being interrogated about a crime. "And the child, did she say anything about how she got there, how long she'd been alone?" She doesn't talk much about the past," Richard admitted. "She seems traumatized." "Traumatized how?" Deborah leaned forward, genuinely interested. "Physical signs of abuse, specific behaviors." "Nothing physical that we could note," Richard said. "But she was clearly malnourished, with inadequate clothing, barefoot. And the doll," Eleanor added suddenly. "She has a very battered doll that she won't let go of." Richard looked at his wife, surprised by the observation. Deborah also seemed interested. "Transitional object, common in children who have experienced traumatic separations." Deborah made more notes. "May I speak with her?" "Of course," Richard said, standing up. "Lily," he called. The girl appeared at the door a few moments later, clearly nervous. She was wearing another dress that Martha had found, but she was still carrying the inseparable rag doll. "Hi, Lily," Deborah said gently, lowering herself to the child's level. "My name is Deborah. Can I ask you a few questions?" Lily looked at Richard, seeking guidance. When he nodded encouragingly, she approached cautiously. "Do you like living here?" Deborah asked. "I like it," Lily replied timidly. "They're nice to me." "And before you came here? Do you remember where you lived?" Lily's eyes clouded over. "A bad place with lots of sad kids." "A foster home," Deborah suggested softly. "I think so. The people there weren't nice." Deborah continued with careful questions, gradually building a picture of Lily's previous life. The girl mentioned fragments of memories, the county foster home, strict staff, other children who sometimes disappeared. "And your family? Do you remember your parents?" "My mother's name was Valerie," Lily said, hugging the doll tighter. "She sang to me." Richard noticed that Eleanor had become tense when the name was mentioned again. "Valerie," Deborah repeated, writing carefully. "Last name?" "I don't know," said Lily sadly. "And did she work somewhere that you remember?" "With noisy machines. It smelled like new fabric." Deborah looked at Richard. "A textile factory?" "Possibly," he replied, but his mind was racing. Oakhaven had several textile factories, including his own. "Lily, do you remember anything else about where your mother worked?" The girl closed her eyes, concentrating. It was a big place, with lots of women, and there was a man who sometimes yelled at your mother? At all of them. My mother always got scared when he showed up. Eleanor stood up abruptly. Maybe that's enough for today. The girl is clearly upset by these questions, but Deborah wasn't finished. Mrs. Sterling, is the name Valerie familiar to you, considering you have a textile company? We've had hundreds of employees over the years, Eleanor replied quickly. It would be impossible to remember them all. Of course, Deborah said, but there was something in her voice that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Mr. Sterling, would it be possible to check the personnel files? An employee named Valerie, who worked there in the last, say, 7 years. Certainly, Richard said, although he didn't understand why he felt a knot growing in his stomach. At that moment, Ethan came down the stairs, having heard strange voices. When he saw Deborah, he stopped abruptly. Ethan Sterling? Deborah asked, consulting her notes. Son of the owners? Yes, he replied cautiously. Were you home when your father brought Lily? No, I arrived the next day. And what was your reaction when you heard about the situation? Ethan looked at his mother, then at his father, clearly realizing that there was more at stake than a simple welfare check. I was surprised, he said carefully, but Lily is a sweet kid. I don't see a problem with helping her. Interesting, murmured Deborah, making more notes. And everyone in the family agrees with that assessment? The silence that followed was revealing. Eleanor stared blankly out the window, Richard looked uncomfortable, and Ethan watched everything with growing suspicion. Is there anything else we should know? Deborah asked finally. What do you mean? Richard questioned. I received a call last night, anonymous but very specific. The person suggested that I investigate not only Lily's well-being but also certain labor practices of the Sterling Company related to migrant employees. The silence in the room became oppressive. Richard looked at Eleanor, who had paled visibly. I don't understand the connection, he said, but his voice sounded less convincing than he intended. Neither do I yet, Deborah admitted, putting away her papers. But I intend to find out. I'll be checking the personnel files, talking to former employees, investigating any labor complaints from the last few years. She stood up, heading for the door. Lily can stay here for now, but this situation needs to be legally regularized within 2 weeks, or she will have to be transferred to official care. 2 weeks? Richard repeated, horrified. It's generous, considering the circumstances, Deborah said. And gentlemen, if there's any additional information you'd like to share, it would be better to do so voluntarily. Investigations have a way of uncovering things that people would prefer to keep buried. After she left, a heavy silence filled the room. Lily had hidden behind Richard, clearly frightened by the tension in the house. 2 weeks, murmured Eleanor, but she didn't seem surprised or worried. She seemed relieved? Eleanor, Richard said slowly, do you know anything about an employee named Valerie? Why would I? She replied, but she avoided his eyes. Because, Ethan said suddenly, your reaction yesterday when Lily mentioned the name was too specific to be just coincidence. Eleanor stared at them for a moment, then smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Perhaps you'll discover that some truths are more painful than you imagine, she said, leaving the room with determined steps. Richard stared at the door through which she had left, a terrible certainty growing in his mind. His wife not only knew Valerie, but there was something about the disappearance of Lily's mother that Eleanor definitely didn't want to be discovered. Richard spent the entire afternoon in the company office, searching personnel files from the last 7 years, with almost desperate determination. Each folder he opened, each name he read, increased his anxiety. When he finally found what he was looking for, his blood ran cold. Valerie Johnson, he read aloud, his hands trembling slightly as he held the employee file. Hired in January 2019, terminated in August of the same year. Reason: job abandonment. But there was something strange about the records. Valerie's performance evaluations were excellent, punctual, dedicated, skilled. It didn't make sense that someone like that would simply abandon their job without explanation. Richard flipped through the attached documents and found something that left him even more confused. A series of disciplinary reports signed by Eleanor, who at the time supervised the Human Resources Department. According to the reports, Valerie had been warned multiple times for inappropriate behavior and questioning authority. "This doesn't make sense," he murmured, comparing the dates. The positive production evaluations were later than the disciplinary reports. It was as if two different people were evaluating the same employee. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him look up. Martha appeared at the door, looking hesitant. "Mr. Sterling, sorry to bother you, but little Lily is asking for you. She had a nightmare." Richard quickly put away the documents. "Of course, Martha. I'm coming." When he got home, he found Lily in the kitchen with Martha, drawing compulsively. There were at least 10 drawings scattered across the table, all showing the same scene. A woman crying surrounded by sewing machines, while a shadowy figure watched from afar. "Lily?" he called softly. She looked up, her eyes red from crying. "I had a bad dream about my mom," she said. "She was scared." Richard picked up one of the drawings, studying it carefully. The shadowy figure in the background was clearly a woman, with her hair pulled back and formal clothes. There was something familiar in the posture, in the way she was positioned. "Lily, can you remember anything else about where your mother worked? Who scared her?" "It was a mean lady," Lily said, picking up another pencil. "She always yelled at the women who worked there. My mom said she didn't like people like us. Like you?" "Poor," Lily explained with the brutal simplicity of childhood. "The mean lady said people like us should be grateful to have a job." Richard felt nausea grow in his stomach. "Lily, could you draw this mean lady?" The girl hesitated, then picked up a new paper. With intense concentration, she began to draw. What emerged made Richard recoil involuntarily. It was unmistakably Eleanor. The hair, the posture, even the icy expression of superiority, it was all there, seen through the eyes of a traumatized child. "My God," whispered Martha, who had been watching over Lily's shoulder. At that moment, loud voices came from the living room. Richard recognized Ethan's voice, clearly arguing with someone. "Stay here with Martha," he said to Lily, heading quickly to the source of the conflict. In the living room, he found Ethan standing before Eleanor, who was sitting on the sofa with an expression of irritated superiority. "Can't just ignore the questions," Ethan was saying. "That social worker isn't an idiot, Mom. She's going to find out the truth." "The truth about what?" Richard asked, entering the room. Eleanor and Ethan turned to him, both looking guilty for having been caught in the middle of an argument. "I was trying to convince your mother to be honest about what she knows," said Ethan. "About Valerie," added Richard, carefully observing Eleanor's reaction. "I've already said I don't know anything specific," she replied, but her voice was strained. "Eleanor," Richard said, approaching her, "I found Valerie's personnel files. You signed disciplinary reports against her." A flicker of something, panic, passed through Eleanor's eyes before she recomposed herself. "It was my job to supervise the personnel department. I signed many disciplinary reports, but these were contradictory with the production evaluations, as if someone were trying to create a false history of behavioral problems." "Are you accusing me of falsifying documents?" Eleanor asked, her voice taking on a dangerous tone. "I'm trying to understand why an exemplary employee suddenly became problematic just before disappearing." "Maybe because you didn't know your employees as well as you think," Eleanor retorted. "Valerie Johnson was problematic from day one. She questioned procedures, asked impertinent questions, influenced other employees against management." "What kind of questions?" Ethan insisted. Eleanor hesitated, realizing she had said too much. Questions about overtime, about working conditions, things that weren't her business. Or were legitimate labor concerns that you wanted to silence? Suggested Richard, a terrible suspicion growing in his mind. Be careful with your accusations, Richard, Eleanor warned, standing up. You might discover things about your precious company that you'd rather not know. What does that mean? It means that not everything we've built has been done with methods you would approve of, she said, heading for the door. And if you keep digging, you might find that your clean conscience is more fragile than you imagine. After she left, Richard sank into an armchair, feeling the weight of revelations he didn't yet fully comprehend. Dad, said Ethan, sitting down beside him, I think my mom is involved in something very serious. I think so too, Richard admitted. The question is, how serious? At that moment, Martha appeared at the door, looking alarmed. Mr. Sterling, there's someone on the phone. Says she's a former employee of the company and needs to talk urgently about Valerie Johnson. Richard exchanged a meaningful look with Ethan before heading to the phone. Hello? Mr. Sterling? The voice on the other end was female, nervous. My name is Rosa Miller. I worked at your company 3 years ago. I heard you're looking for information about Valerie. Yes, any information would be helpful. I can't talk on the phone, but you need to know that Valerie didn't abandon her job. She was forced to leave. And there's more. Things your wife doesn't want to come to light. What kind of things? Meet me tomorrow night at the Town Square coffee shop at 8 o'clock. And sir, be careful. There are people who will do anything to keep those secrets buried. The line went dead, leaving Richard staring at the phone with a growing sense of dread. Who was it? Ethan asked. Someone who might have answers, Richard replied. But something tells me I'm not going to like what I find out. That night, as the family ate dinner in tense silence, Lily asked an innocent question that chilled everyone's blood. Uncle Richard, why did the mean lady from my drawings live in the same house as you? Eleanor dropped her fork on the plate with a loud clatter, her eyes fixed on the girl with an expression that mixed shock and something very close to hatred. What did you say? She asked, her voice dangerously low. In my dreams, I remember going to a big house with Mommy. The mean lady was there, yelling. It was the same lady who worked at the factory. Richard looked at Eleanor, who had turned as pale as paper. Eleanor, he said slowly, was Valerie ever in our house? The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Eleanor stood up from the table with rigid movements. I don't know what the girl is talking about, she said, but her voice trembled. Children confuse dreams with reality. But as she left the dining room, Richard noticed that her hands were shaking, and for the first time in 25 years of marriage, he was certain, absolute certainty, that his wife was lying. The Town Square coffee shop was almost empty when Richard arrived, 10 minutes before the appointed time. He chose a table in the back, from where he could observe the entrance, and ordered just a coffee he didn't intend to drink. His nerves had been on edge since Lily's revelation the night before. Rosa Miller arrived exactly at 8 o'clock. She was a woman of approximately 40 years old, graying brown hair pulled back in a simple bun, wearing modest but clean clothes. Her eyes darted nervously around the room before locating him. Mr. Sterling? She asked, approaching hesitantly. Rosa, thank you for coming, Richard said, standing up to greet her. Please, sit down. She settled into the chair opposite him, refusing the coffee he offered. I shouldn't be doing this, she said, her hands trembling slightly. But when I heard they'd found Valerie's daughter... You're sure Lily is her daughter? I am. Valerie talked about the girl constantly, showed pictures, told stories. That child was her world. Rosa paused, taking a deep breath. That's why what happened was so terrible. What happened, Rosa? Valerie discovered something she shouldn't have, about the working conditions at the factory, about how some employees were treated. Rosa looked around nervously before continuing, especially the migrant women, the ones who came from other towns looking for work. Richard felt a chill in his stomach. What kind of treatment? Your wife, pardon me, Mrs. Sterling, she had a scheme, promised work and housing to desperate women, especially single mothers. But when they arrived, they discovered that the conditions were very different from what was promised. How so? Overcrowded accommodations, wages withheld under the pretext of lodging costs, working hours that violated all labor laws. Rosa paused, gathering courage. And whoever complained, well, it was easy to make a woman without local family simply disappear. Richard felt nauseous. Disappear how? Dismissals forged for job abandonment, documents altered, disciplinary records falsified, then pressure to leave town quickly. Some were even threatened. And Valerie discovered this. More than that, she started documenting everything, taking photos, collecting evidence, said she was going to report it to the Labor Board. Rosa lowered her voice. That's when things got really dangerous for her. Eleanor knew she was investigating. She knew, and she was furious, started pressuring Valerie in every way possible, changed her schedules, put her on the most difficult shifts, made her life hell. Richard thought of the disciplinary reports he had found. And when that didn't work, Mrs. Sterling tried a different approach, invited Valerie to her house, said she wanted to resolve the situation like civilized women. Richard's heart raced. Valerie went. She did, even took her little daughter because she had no one to leave her with. Thought that being a conversation at home, it would be friendlier. Rosa laughed bitterly. How wrong she was. What happened at the house? We never knew exactly. Valerie came back to work the next day, different, scared. Said they had threatened both her and her daughter. That if she continued with the investigations, terrible things could happen to the girl. Richard closed his eyes, imagining the terror that Valerie must have felt. And she stopped investigating? For a few weeks, yes. But the fear for her daughter's safety consumed her. She knew that as long as they stayed in town, they would be in danger. Rosa paused, her own memories clearly painful. That's when she made the most difficult decision of her life. What decision? To run. But she knew she couldn't take her daughter. A woman alone, without resources, fleeing powerful people, the girl would be an easy target, a weight that would make escape impossible. So she left Lily at the county foster home, promising to come back when it was safe. Said it would only be temporary, that she would find a way to prove the company's irregularities, and then come back to get her daughter. Tears began to stream down Rosa's face, but she never came back. What happened to her? No one knows for sure. Left town one night without telling anyone. Some say she managed to escape, others... Rosa didn't finish the sentence. Others what? Others think she never made it out of Oakhaven. That powerful people ensured she could never tell what she knew. A heavy silence filled the table. Richard processed the terrible implications of what he was hearing. Rosa, do you have proof of any of this? Some, she said hesitantly. Valerie gave me a copy of some documents before she fled. Said that if anything happened to her, I should give them to the authorities. And you didn't? I was afraid, she admitted. I'm a widow. I have 2 daughters to raise. I couldn't risk losing my job or putting my family in danger. But now that they've found Valerie's daughter, I can't stay silent anymore. That child deserves to know the truth about what happened to her mother. Rosa opened her purse and pulled out a yellowed envelope. It's all here. Photos of the housing conditions, copies of altered documents, a list of women who disappeared after complaining. Richard took the envelope with trembling hands. Why are you giving this to me? How do you know you can trust me? Because I saw how you treated Lily when you brought her home. And because, she hesitated, because I think you didn't know any of this. Your employees always spoke well of you, said you were fair, honest. The problem was always the shadow management. Shadow management? Your wife had her own system of managing certain operations, things that never passed through your desk, reports that never reached your office. Richard felt as if the floor were disappearing beneath his feet. How long has this been going on? Years. At least since I started working there in 2016, maybe longer. And other employees knew. Some suspected, but whoever talked too much ended up fired for cost-cutting or restructuring. The message was clear: keep quiet or lose your job. Richard put the envelope in the inside pocket of his coat. "Rosa, would you be willing to speak with the authorities? With the social worker who's investigating Lily's case? If necessary, yes. But I need guarantees that my family will be protected." "I'll arrange that," Richard promised, although he didn't know exactly how. When Rosa got up to leave, she turned one last time. "Mr. Sterling, be very careful. Your wife, she's not what she seems, and people who have built secrets as big as these are capable of anything to protect them." After she left, Richard remained sitting at the coffee shop for more than an hour, the envelope burning in his pocket as evidence of a betrayal that went far beyond the personal. His company, his reputation, his entire life had been built on a foundation of exploitation and lies that he hadn't even suspected existed. When he finally got home, he found the mansion strangely silent. Martha had left, Lily was sleeping, and there was no sign of Eleanor or Ethan. He went up to his home office and opened the envelope. What he saw in the first photographs made him run to the bathroom and vomit. The images showed housing that looked more like prisons, women crammed into small rooms, children sleeping on the floor, deplorable sanitary conditions. And in several photos, supervising everything with a satisfied expression, was Eleanor. When he finally managed to compose himself and return to the documents, he found something that made him stop completely. Among the papers was a photograph of Valerie with Lily, both smiling. On the back, written in the mother's delicate handwriting, was a message. "For my little Lily, Mommy will always come back to you, I promise. Valerie Johnson, August 2019. But there was a second line, written in a different, more aggressive handwriting. "Broken promises have consequences. E.S." Richard let the photo fall, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The initials were unmistakable. Eleanor Sterling. His wife not only knew what had happened to Valerie, she had been directly responsible for it. Richard couldn't sleep all night. He sat in his office, Rosa's documents scattered across the table, trying to process the magnitude of what he had discovered. Each photo, each document, was a piece of a puzzle that revealed not only the extent of the corruption in his own company, but also the calculating coldness of the woman he had been married to for more than 2 decades. At 5 in the morning, he heard movement in the house. Cautious footsteps coming down the stairs, the sound of the kitchen door opening. Richard approached the window and saw Eleanor in the garden, talking on the phone with agitated gestures. He went down silently and positioned himself near the back door, managing to capture fragments of the conversation. "No, it can't be a coincidence," she was saying, her voice tense. "The child is remembering too many things. Yes, I know the risks." "No, Richard can't find out, not yet." Richard felt his blood run cold. Eleanor wasn't just trying to hide the past, she was actively working to keep her secrets buried. "If necessary, we find a way to remove the girl from the equation," she continued. "The state foster home in Tallahassee would be ideal. No, not physically, I'm not stupid. But there are legal ways to ensure that a traumatized child is considered too unstable to give reliable testimony." Richard recoiled, horrified. Eleanor was planning to use the system against Lily, manipulate the situation so that the girl would be removed before she could reveal more compromising memories. When Eleanor finished the call and went back inside, Richard was already back in his office, pretending to work. But his mind was racing, planning his next moves. At 7 in the morning, Ethan came down for breakfast, finding his father in the kitchen with a cup of cold coffee in his hands and eyes red from exhaustion. "Dad, did you sleep?" "Not much," Richard admitted. "Ethan, I need to talk to you, alone." They went to the office, where Richard closed the door and showed his son a carefully selected selection of the documents that Rosa had given him, enough to reveal the truth, but not so much that it put Ethan in immediate danger. Ethan examined the photos and documents in growing silence, his face paling with each page. "My God," he murmured finally. This is real, very real. And your mother, is at the center of it all. But you didn't know any of this. Nothing, Richard said bitterly. She created a shadow system, operations that never passed through my desk. While I thought I was running an ethical company, she was running an exploitation scheme. Ethan threw the photos on the table, clearly nauseated. And Valerie, Lily's mother, discovered all of this and tried to report it. Eleanor threatened her, forced her to flee the city, and left her daughter behind, Ethan completed, the reality of the situation finally becoming clear. Ethan, your mother is planning something against Lily. I overheard a call this morning. She wants to remove the girl before more memories come to light. Ethan stood up abruptly, starting to pace back and forth. We can't let that happen. We won't let it, but we need to be very careful. Eleanor has allies, people who have benefited from this scheme. If we act rashly, she could make Lily disappear too, concluded Ethan, the terrible possibility hanging between them. At that moment, they heard Lily's voice in the hallway, talking cheerfully with Martha. The child's innocent normalcy contrasted cruelly with the sinister conspiracy unfolding around her. We need to contact Deborah Johnson, Richard said. Hand over this evidence and ensure protection for Lily. And my mother, your mother, Richard said with difficulty, will have to face the consequences of her actions. They were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Voices in the hall. Eleanor had arrived, accompanied by someone. "Richard," she called, "come here, please. We have visitors." Father and son went downstairs, finding Eleanor in the living room with a man that Richard recognized immediately. Dr. Kenneth Wagner, a child psychiatrist respected throughout the region, known for his rigorous evaluations in child custody cases. "Dr. Wagner," Richard said cautiously. "What a surprise to see you here." "Mr. Sterling," the doctor replied, shaking his hand. "Your wife asked me to do an assessment of the situation of the child you've taken in, legitimate concerns about trauma and emotional stability." Richard looked at Eleanor, who smiled with poorly disguised satisfaction. "What kind of assessment?" "Standard for cases like this," Dr. Wagner explained, "assessing whether the child is fit to remain in a family environment or whether she needs specialized institutional care." Richard immediately understood Eleanor's strategy. If Dr. Wagner determined that Lily was fantasizing about her memories, any future testimony would be dismissed as a product of trauma and mental instability. "Naturally, we agreed to an assessment," Eleanor said before Richard could respond. "We want what's best for the child." "Great. May I speak with her now?" At that moment, Lily appeared at the door, carrying some of her drawings. When she saw the stranger in the room, she hid instinctively behind Richard. "Lily," said Eleanor with false gentleness, "this is Dr. Wagner. He's very nice and wants to ask you a few questions." "I don't want to," Lily said simply, clutching the drawings to her chest. "See," Eleanor said to the doctor, "antisocial behavior, excessive distrust. Clearly signs of disturbance." Dr. Wagner crouched down to Lily's level. "Hi, little one, are those your drawings? Can I see them?" Lily looked at Richard, seeking guidance. He nodded reluctantly, knowing that refusing would be interpreted as obstructionist behavior. Iris shyly showed one of the drawings, the one depicting the woman crying surrounded by sewing machines, with the shadowy figure watching. "Very interesting," Dr. Wagner murmured. "Iris, can you tell me about this drawing?" "It's my mom at work," said Iris. "She was sad because the mean lady yelled at her." "The mean lady?" Dr. Wagner examined the drawing more carefully. "Can you tell me more about her?" "She didn't like Mom. She said people like us weren't good enough," Eleanor quickly interjected. "Doctor, as you can see, the girl has very elaborate fantasies about people she's never met. It's exactly the kind of troubling behavior I mentioned." "But Dr." Wagner was studying the drawing with growing interest. "Iris, have you seen this mean lady anywhere else? Not at your mum's work?" "Yes," Iris said innocently. "She lived in a big house just like this one. I went there with Mom once. She yelled a lot and made Mom cry. The silence in the room became oppressive. Dr. Wagner looked from the drawing to Eleanor, then to Richard, clearly processing the implications of what he had just heard. "Miss Sterling," he said slowly, "the child is describing a woman in your house. That's concerning." "She's confusing places," Eleanor said quickly. "Fragmented memories from trauma can create these false connections." But Dr. Wagner had noticed something else in the drawing. "Iris, can you draw the house where you saw the mean lady?" "I can," said Iris, picking up a pencil. In a few minutes, she had sketched a house that was unequivocally the Sterling mansion, the specific porch, the unique architectural details, even the arrangement of the windows. Dr. Wagner compared the two drawings, then looked around the room where they were, making obvious connections. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice now cold and professional, "I think we need to have a very serious conversation about the real reason you called me here." Eleanor had paled completely, realizing that her own strategy had backfired. In her attempt to discredit Iris, she had inadvertently provided a respected professional with clear evidence that the child was telling the truth about prior connections to the family. "Doctor," she said, trying to regain her composure, "I can explain—" "I hope you can," said Dr. Wagner, gathering his papers. "Because if this child has actually been in your house before, as her drawings clearly indicate, then there's a lot more to this situation than I've been told." Richard watched his wife slowly unravel, knowing that the castle of lies she had built was finally starting to crumble. But he also knew that a cornered Eleanor would be more dangerous than ever. Dr. Wagner remained in the room for another 2 hours, asking increasingly specific questions that made Eleanor visibly uncomfortable. When he finally left, he promised to return the next day with colleagues specializing in complex cases, his words laden with ominous implications. As soon as the door closed, Eleanor exploded. "You've ruined everything!" she screamed, her mask of composure finally dropping completely. "Years of careful work, and you gave it all away because of a lying brat." "Lying?" Richard repeated, his own anger finally emerging. "Eleanor, I've seen the evidence. I know about the scheme, about the migrant workers, about Valerie." Eleanor's face went ashen. "What evidence?" "Photographs, documents, witnesses." Richard approached her, his voice low but filled with contained fury. "I know you threatened Valerie in this house. I know you forced her to abandon her daughter and flee town." "Prove it," Eleanor said defiantly, but there was panic in her eyes. "I can prove it, and I will. The question now is, what else have you done? Did Valerie really manage to escape, or did you ensure she could never tell what she knew?" For a moment, Eleanor seemed on the verge of confessing something terrible. But then she composed herself, assuming a calculating expression that Richard had never seen before. "Be careful with your accusations, Richard," she said coldly. "You might find that your own position isn't as secure as you imagine." "What does that mean?" "It means that you signed all the contracts, approved all the budgets, hired all the supervisors. In the official documentation, you are responsible for everything that happened at this company." Richard felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "You forged my signature?" "I didn't need to forge anything. You signed everything I put on your desk, blindly trusting me to take care of the administrative details." Eleanor smiled cruelly. A man so busy building his empire that he never bothered to check exactly how it was being built. "You're lying." "Am I?" "Then explain to the authorities how you knew nothing about operations that generated 30% of the company's revenue. Explain how the owner and president had no knowledge of housing contracts, labor agreements, disciplinary policies." Ethan, who had been watching everything in shocked silence, finally spoke up. "Mom, are you threatening Dad with crimes that you committed?" "I'm protecting this family the way I always have," Eleanor retorted. "And if you had any sense at all, you'd understand that destroying everything because of one child is insane." "That child," said Richard, "is the daughter of a woman you destroyed. a woman who only wanted decent working conditions. Valerie Johnson was a threat to the stability of hundreds of jobs, Eleanor replied. Her decent conditions would have cost millions, forced mass layoffs, destroyed entire families. So, you decided to destroy her family specifically. I made difficult decisions to protect the greater good, something you never had the courage to do. At that moment, Martha appeared in the doorway, clearly disturbed by the shouting. Excuse me, but little Iris is scared. She wants to know if everything is okay. The mention of Iris seemed to reignite Eleanor's fury. That child, she said, her voice laced with venom, should have stayed where she was, in the foster home, where people like her belong. People like her? Richard repeated, horrified by his wife's coldness. Children of troublesome employees, children without a proper family, without resources, without a future. The foster home was the appropriate place for her. The foster home where she was abused? The foster home where she would learn her place in society, Eleanor corrected. Something she apparently will never learn here, being pampered and encouraged to make up stories about important people. Martha, who had remained in the doorway listening to everything, couldn't contain herself. "Ma'am," she said, her voice trembling with indignation, "that child isn't making anything up. I worked in this house when her mother came here. I saw how you treated her." Eleanor turned to Martha like a snake ready to strike. "You were here?" "I was. And I remember every word you said to that poor woman, how you threatened not only her, but her daughter too." "You'll regret speaking," Eleanor hissed. "I already do," Martha replied bravely. "I regret having stayed silent for so long." The tension in the room was becoming unbearable when the phone rang. Richard answered, and the voice on the other end made his blood run cold. "Mr. Sterling, this is Deborah Johnson. I need to inform you that we have received a formal complaint regarding irregularities at your company. I'll be there in an hour with an investigation team." "What kind of complaint?" Richard asked, though he suspected the answer. "Labor exploitation, document forgery, threats against employees. The allegations are very serious, sir. And there's a specific request for immediate removal of the child Iris from your residence, alleging an unstable and potentially dangerous family environment." Richard looked at Eleanor, who was smiling with malicious satisfaction. "Who made this complaint?" "A concerned citizen who preferred to remain anonymous. But the evidence provided is substantial." When Richard hung up, Eleanor was clearly triumphant. "See how easy it is to use the system against you?" she said. "In an hour, Iris will be on her way to an appropriate institution, and you'll be answering criminal charges." "You made this complaint," Ethan accused. "I did what was necessary to protect this family. Now you'll discover that being sentimental has consequences." Richard felt panic rising in his chest. "Eleanor, stop this. Withdraw the complaint." Too late. The gears are already in motion. It was then that Iris appeared in the doorway, her big eyes fixed on Eleanor with an expression that mingled fear and something close to recognition. "I know you," she said simply. "You're the mean lady who made my mom cry." Eleanor glared at the child with pure hatred. "You should have stayed where you were, you little pest." "Eleanor!" Richard shouted, horrified by the cruelty directed at a child. But Iris didn't flinch. Instead, she approached Eleanor with the inexplicable courage of innocence. "Where's my mom?" she asked. "What did you do to her?" "Your mother," Eleanor said with calculated cruelty, "learned that some people are more important than others, and that those who don't understand that, well, they find their appropriate place." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of cars arriving in the driveway of the mansion. Through the window, they could see several official vehicles, including a Child Protective Services van. "1 hour," Richard murmured, looking at his watch. "She arrived early." "Because," Eleanor said with final satisfaction, "I said there was an emergency, that the child was in immediate danger of traumatic influence." As the knocks on the door began, Authoritative and insistent, Richard looked at Iris, who was clinging to his leg with tear-filled eyes. "I won't let them take you," he promised, but his words rang hollow even to him. Outside, Deborah Johnson's voice was clear and firm. "Open the door. We have a court order for search and seizure." Eleanor walked triumphantly towards the door, savoring her victory. But as her hand touched the doorknob, a voice stopped her. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Everyone turned to see Ethan at the end of the hallway, holding a cell phone. "I just sent a recording of this entire conversation to 3 different addresses," he said calmly, "including the district attorney's office." Eleanor's face twisted into a mask of absolute fury, and for the first time, Richard saw his wife exactly as she really was, a woman capable of anything to protect her secrets, even if it meant destroying an innocent child. The recording that Ethan had sent changed everything in a matter of minutes. When Deborah Johnson entered the mansion with her team, it was no longer to remove Iris, but to confront Eleanor with evidence of perjury and manipulation of the legal system. "Mrs. Sterling," Deborah said, her voice as cold as ice, "I need to inform you that we have just received evidence that your complaint was based on false information and motivated by personal interest in silencing a witness." Eleanor tried to maintain her composure, but the panic was visible in her eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about." A recording of approximately 15 minutes where you confess to several illegal practices and directly threaten a 6-year-old child. Deborah looked at Iris, who was clinging to Richard's leg. "Practices that include the exploitation of migrant workers and possible involvement in the disappearance of Valerie Johnson." "That recording is inadmissible," Eleanor tried. "It was made without my consent." "Actually," intervened one of the investigators accompanying Deborah, "recordings made in one's own home by family members are perfectly legal when there is suspicion of crimes being committed." Richard watched his wife slowly crumble, but there was something in her expression that worried him. Eleanor didn't seem defeated. She seemed desperate, and a desperate person was unpredictable. "Iris," said Deborah, crouching down next to the girl, "can you tell me what you remember about your mother in this house?" "Mom came here once," said Iris, her voice small but clear. "The mean lady yelled at her and said mean things. Mom cried a lot." "What kind of mean things?" "She said Mom was poor and no good, that if she told secrets to other people, bad things would happen to me." Deborah made careful notes. "And your mom was scared?" "Very scared. After that, she always cried when she thought I wasn't looking." Eleanor could no longer contain herself. "See," she exploded, "a traumatized child making up dramatic stories. This doesn't prove anything." "Actually," said Deborah, "it proves quite a bit when combined with physical evidence and adult testimony." At that moment, Martha stepped forward. "I can confirm everything the girl is saying," she said bravely. "I was working here when her mother came. I heard the whole argument." "Martha, you're fired," Eleanor hissed. "Actually," Richard intervened, "Martha is not fired, and she was never subordinate to you, Eleanor." The revelation that Richard was taking control of the situation seemed to be the final blow for Eleanor. She looked around the room, at the husband who had finally discovered her secrets, at the son who had betrayed her, at the child who represented everything she had tried to destroy. And something in her expression changed. "You have no idea what you've destroyed," she said, her voice taking on a dangerously calm tone. "Years of careful work, important relationships, delicate agreements, all ruined by sappy sentimentality." "Eleanor," Richard said cautiously, noting the change in her tone, "it's over. It's best to cooperate with the authorities." "Cooperate?" She laughed, but the sound was full of bitterness. "Cooperating would mean destroying entire families who depend on the jobs I created. It would mean exposing practices that the entire textile industry in this region uses." "Illegal practices," Deborah corrected. "Necessary practices," Eleanor retorted. "You live in a world of ideals." I live in the real world, where difficult decisions have to be made to keep the economy running. Iris, who had been watching everything with wide eyes, suddenly broke away from Richard and walked directly to Eleanor. "Where's my mum?" she asked with the simple persistence of childhood. "You know where she is. Your mother," Eleanor said, looking at the child with a mixture of hatred and something that looked almost like respect for her persistence, "learned that some battles can't be won." "That doesn't answer the question," Deborah said firmly. "Mrs. Sterling, I'm asking you directly. Do you know the current whereabouts of Valerie Johnson?" For a long moment, Eleanor was silent. When she finally spoke, her words chilled everyone in the room. "Valerie Johnson is no longer a problem for anyone," she said simply. "What does that mean?" Richard asked, though he feared the answer. "It means she found a permanent solution to her problems of conscience." The silence that followed was broken by Iris's small voice. "Is my mum dead?" Eleanor looked at the child without a drop of compassion. "Your mother made choices. Choices have consequences. It was Ethan who exploded first." "Are you confessing to murder?" "I'm not confessing to anything," Eleanor said coldly. "I'm simply observing that people who can't adapt to reality tend to find exits." Deborah signaled to her team, who immediately moved to detain Eleanor. But she raised a hand. "Wait," she said. "There's something else you need to know before you arrest me." "Eleanor, be quiet," Richard warned, realizing that his wife was about to dig herself an even deeper hole. "Why? To protect who? You've already destroyed everything." She turned to Deborah. "You want to know about Valerie Johnson? She wasn't the first troublesome employee to disappear, and she wouldn't have been the last if you hadn't interfered." The confession was like a bomb, exploding in the room. Deborah immediately activated her radio. "I need immediate reinforcements. We have a confession of multiple serious crimes." But Eleanor wasn't finished. "And you want to know the most ironic thing of all?" she said, looking directly at Iris. "Your precious mother could have survived if she had simply accepted the money I offered and kept quiet. But no, she had to be a heroine. She had to fight for justice." "You offered her money to stay silent?" Richard asked. "I offered her a civilized solution, a generous sum for her to take her daughter and disappear discreetly, start a new life in another state, far from trouble. And when she refused, Eleanor said, her mask finally falling completely, "it became clear that she would never stop being a problem, that she would always come back, always cause trouble, always threaten everything we built." Iris began to cry silently, finally understanding that her mother was not just lost, she was truly dead. Richard picked her up, feeling a fury greater than anything he had ever experienced. "Eleanor," he said, his voice trembling with contained emotion, "you killed this child's mother. I protected our family, our company, our position in the community," she retorted, "something you never had the courage to do when necessary." "Protected," Ethan shouted. "You became a murderer." "I became a survivor," Eleanor corrected. "And if you had an ounce of sense, you'd understand that sometimes individual sacrifices are necessary for the greater good." Deborah had heard enough. "Eleanor Sterling, you are under arrest for the crimes of labor exploitation, threats, document forgery, and suspicion of homicide." As the investigators approached her with handcuffs, Eleanor looked one last time at Iris. "You should have stayed where you were," she said coldly. "Your mother died for nothing. You'll never be able to prove that I did anything other than protect my family." But it was at that moment that Iris, still in Richard's arms, said something that stopped everyone in the room. "You're wrong," the girl said, her voice small but firm. "Mum didn't die for nothing. She died because she wanted other mums not to suffer like she suffered. And now I'm going to grow up and tell her story to everyone." For the first time since it all began, Eleanor seemed truly shaken. Looking at that 6-year-old child who had survived everything she had tried to do to silence her, she finally understood that she had lost more than her freedom. She had lost her soul to a child who was stronger than she had ever imagined possible. As they led her handcuffed from the house where she had lived for more than 2 decades, Eleanor Sterling left behind a destroyed family, a compromised company, and an orphaned child who would forever carry the scars of what she had done. But she also left something she didn't expect, a non-traditional family that had formed around the love and protection of an innocent child, stronger than anything she had tried to build through fear and manipulation. The days following Eleanor's arrest were a whirlwind of investigations, interviews, and revelations that shook not only the Sterling family, but the entire community of Oakhaven. The textile company was temporarily shut down, while federal auditors scoured every document, every contract, every record from the past 10 years. Richard found himself at the center of a storm that threatened to destroy everything he had built throughout his life. Although preliminary investigations suggested that he was truly unaware of Eleanor's illegal operations, his reputation in the community was in ruins. "Dad," Ethan said one morning, finding Richard in his office surrounded by legal papers, "the lawyers are here." 3 men in suits entered the room, carrying briefcases that contained the future of the company and possibly Richard's freedom. "Mr. Sterling," said the lead attorney, "we have good news and bad news. The good news, the evidence strongly suggests that you were unaware of the illegal operations. The bad news, this does not completely exempt you from civil and criminal liability as the owner of the company." "What does that mean in practice?" Richard asked, though he feared the answer. "It means you probably won't be arrested, but you will face substantial fines, compensation to the victims, and possible bankruptcy of the company." Richard nodded, accepting the verdict with a resignation that surprised even himself. In recent days, he had discovered that there were things more important than money and social status. "And the employees who were exploited?" he asked. "What can we do for them?" The lawyers exchanged surprised glances. It was not common for a businessman facing financial ruin to worry first about the victims. "There are several options. We can establish a compensation fund, offer professional relocation, cover medical treatment when necessary." "Do all of that," Richard said without hesitating. "Use all the resources necessary. Sir, this may mean the total loss of your personal fortune." "Then so be it." Meanwhile, in another room of the mansion, Iris was sitting with Martha and Dr. Wagner, who had returned after the dramatic events of the previous days. This time, however, his mission was quite different. "Iris," he said gently, "do you understand what happened to your mother?" The girl nodded sadly. "The mean lady hurt her, made her not able to come back to me. And how do you feel about that?" "Sad," Iris said simply, "but also relieved." "Relieved how?" "Because now I know that Mom didn't abandon me. She wanted to come back to me, but she couldn't." Dr. Wagner made notes, impressed by the ability of such a young child to process such traumatic information in a relatively healthy way. "And what do you feel for Uncle Richard and Ethan?" Iris's face lit up. "They take care of me. They protected me from the mean lady. They're my family now. Even knowing that the mean lady was married to Uncle Richard?" Iris considered this for a moment. "Uncle Richard didn't know she was bad. When he found out, he protected me. That's what matters." 3 weeks later, an unexpected event changed everything again. Deborah Johnson arrived at the mansion with an expression that mingled hope and apprehension. "I have news about Valerie," she said, sitting down in the room where it had all begun. Richard, Ethan, and Iris looked at her expectantly, fearing what they might discover. Based on Eleanor's confessions, we launched extensive searches. And, well, we found something. "What did you find?" Richard asked. "Valerie Johnson is alive." The silence that followed was absolute. Iris was the first to react. "My mom is alive," she whispered, tears beginning to stream down her face. "She is, but—" Deborah hesitated. "The situation is complicated." "Complicated how?" Ethan asked. "Valerie suffered a serious accident when she was trying to leave town, an accident that, according to our investigation, was arranged by people connected to Eleanor. She survived, but suffered serious injuries and significant memory loss. Richard felt a mixture of relief and horror. Where is she now? In a special care facility in Tallahassee. She doesn't remember almost anything from the last 5 years, including... Deborah looked at Iris. Including having a daughter. Iris absorbed this information with surprising maturity. She doesn't remember me? Not at this time. But doctors say there is a chance of gradual memory recovery, especially with familiar stimuli. Can I see her? Iris asked immediately. Yes, but we need to prepare you for the possibility that she may not recognize you initially. 2 days later, the trip to Tallahassee was one of the most tense Richard had ever made. Iris was silent in the back seat, holding her battered rag doll and looking out the window as she processed the possibility of reuniting with a mother who might not remember her. The facility was clean and well-maintained, but still too hospital-like to be welcoming. When they arrived at Valerie's room, Richard almost didn't recognize her. The woman he remembered as a dedicated and vibrant employee was thin, frail, with prematurely grey hair and eyes that seemed to be always searching for something they couldn't find. Valerie, Deborah said softly, we've brought some people to meet you. Valerie looked at them without recognition, her gaze lingering on Iris for a longer moment, as if something in her mind was trying to make a connection. Hi, she said timidly. Do you know me? Iris approached slowly, her hands trembling. Mom, she whispered. Mom, Valerie repeated, confused. I have a daughter? You do, said Iris, her tears now running freely. And I've missed you every day. Valerie looked at the child with growing fascination. You look familiar, like I should know you. Iris pulled the rag doll from her pocket. You gave me this. You said that whenever I looked at it, I would remember your love. Valerie took the doll with trembling hands, studying it carefully. For a moment, something seemed to pass through her eyes, a flicker of recognition, a memory trying to emerge. I sewed this, she asked, touching the homemade patches delicately. You did, and you sang me a song when I was sad. What song? Iris began to sing softly a simple melody about little birds. As her voice filled the room, Valerie began to cry. I know that song, she whispered. How do I know that song? Because you're my mum, said Iris, moving closer. And it doesn't matter if you don't remember now. I remember for both of us. At that moment, something extraordinary happened. Valerie held out her arms, and Iris ran into them, embracing the mother she had lost and found again. My girl, Valerie murmured, the words coming out instinctively. My little girl. Although she didn't consciously remember, her heart recognized the love she had carried during all those lost years. Dr. Wegner, who had accompanied the visit, watched everything with professional interest. This is a very promising first step, he said. The emotional bond may be the key to memory recovery. But as they left the facility, a new reality began to take shape. Valerie was alive, but would need specialized care for an indefinite time. Iris had found her mother, but now faced the prospect of another kind of separation. Uncle Richard, she said in the car, is my mom gonna be okay? We're going to do everything we can to help her, he promised. And in the meantime, you have a home with us for as long as you need. Even with all the problems we caused? Richard stopped the car and turned to look at her. Iris, you didn't cause problems. You brought truth. And sometimes the truth is painful, but it's always necessary. That night, back in Oak Haven, they began to plan a future that none of them had imagined months ago, a future where a non-traditional family would form around the love and determination to heal wounds that seemed unhealable. But there was still one last surprise waiting for them, one that would change everything once again. The last surprise came 3 months later, when Richard least expected it. He was in his temporary office. The mansion had been sold to pay for the compensation to Eleanor's victims, organizing the final details of the transfer of the company to a group of worker cooperatives when Rosa Miller appeared at his door. "Mr. Sterling," she said, looking nervous but determined, "I need to talk to you about something I discovered." Richard invited her in. Rosa had become a central figure in the reorganization of the company, helping to identify and locate all the victims of Eleanor's scheme. "What happened, Rosa?" "I found something in Valerie's personal belongings, things she had left with me before she fled town." Rosa opened an old bag and pulled out a yellowed folder. She wasn't just documenting the company's irregularities. What else was she doing? Investigating Eleanor personally. And she discovered something disturbing. Rosa opened the folder, revealing photographs, documents, and detailed notes. Valerie discovered that Eleanor had done this before, in other cities, with other companies. Richard felt a chill in his stomach. "How so?" "Before marrying you, Eleanor worked as a supervisor in at least 3 other textile companies in the southern region. And in all of them, there were scandals, similar ones, exploited migrant workers, troublesome employees who disappeared." "My God." "But there's more," continued Rosa, her voice trembling. "Valerie found records that at least 2 of these women actually died, suspicious accidents, very similar to what happened to her." Richard looked at the documents with growing horror. Eleanor was a serial killer? Or at least someone who didn't hesitate to eliminate people who threatened her schemes. The marriage to you was probably calculated. She needed a respectable position, a bigger company to operate in. "She used me," Richard murmured, the reality finally crystallizing. 25 years of marriage, and she was just using me as cover for criminal activities. At that moment, Ethan entered the office, coming to fetch his father for another visit to Valerie and Iris. Seeing the expression on their faces, he stopped immediately. "What happened?" Rosa quickly explained her findings. Ethan listened in growing silence, processing the revelation that his mother was much worse than anyone had imagined. "We need to turn this over to the authorities," he said finally. "I already have," said Rosa. "But I also wanted you to know, especially because, well, there's something about Iris you need to know." "What about Iris?" Richard asked, alarmed. "Valerie wasn't randomly chosen as a victim. Eleanor chose her specifically." "Why?" "Because Valerie was a widow, a single mother with no family in the area, the perfect victim profile, someone who could disappear without many questions." Rosa paused. "But also because she was beautiful, intelligent, determined. Everything Eleanor wasn't." "Envy?" suggested Ethan. "More than that. According to Valerie's notes, Eleanor had an obsession with controlling women she considered threats. Women who were everything she wanted to be but never could." The revelation added a new and disturbing layer to their understanding of Eleanor. It wasn't just greed or practicality. It was a deep pathology, a need to destroy anything that made her feel inadequate. "And Iris?" Richard asked. "Why did she keep Iris alive?" "Because an orphaned and traumatized child serves as a constant reminder of the power she wielded over Valerie. It was like a trophy. The silence that followed was heavy with terrible implications. Finally, Ethan spoke. "Dad, do we need to tell Iris this?" "Eventually," said Richard. "When she's older, when she can process information like that. For now, she needs to focus on healing and rebuilding her relationship with her mother." That afternoon, during the weekly visit to Tallahassee, Richard watched Iris and Valerie playing together in the facility's garden. Valerie's progress was slow but consistent. She still hadn't recovered all her memories, but the bond with her daughter was clearly strengthening. "Uncle Richard," said Iris, running up to him, "Mom remembered another song today." "That's wonderful," he said, hugging her. "And how are you feeling?" "Happy," she said simply. "Mom is getting better, and I have you and Ethan taking care of me. It's like having 2 families." Dr. Wagner, who continued to monitor the case, approached the group. "Mr. Sterling, can I have a word with you?" They moved away a little, leaving Iris to continue playing with Valerie. "I have good news," said the doctor. "Valerie's progress has been exceptional. We believe that within 6 months she may be fit for outpatient care." Does that mean she can leave the facility? With adequate support, yes. But she will need ongoing care, medical follow-up, a stable environment. Richard nodded, already knowing what he needed to do. Dr. Wagner, what if we offered them a home, Valerie and Iris living with us? It would be ideal if everyone was willing. A unified family would provide the best environment for Valerie's complete recovery and Iris's emotional stability. That night, on the way back to Oakhaven, Richard made the proposal to Iris and Ethan. What do you think about the idea of Valerie coming to live with us when she's well enough? Really? Exclaimed Iris, her eyes shining. Mom can come home. To our home, Richard corrected gently. If she wants to, and if you want to. I want it so much, Iris said immediately. And you, Ethan? I think it would be perfect, said Ethan. An unconventional family, but a real family. 2 months later, Valerie was discharged from the facility. Although she had not yet recovered all her memories, she had developed a deep connection with Iris and a genuine gratitude to Richard and Ethan, who had saved and protected her daughter when she could not. The new house, a modest but comfortable residence that Richard had bought with the last resources he had left after the compensation payments, became home to a unique family. Valerie, gradually regaining her skills, began to work part-time in a sewing cooperative. Iris attended the local school where she was known for her colorful drawings and her ability to make friends easily. Richard had found work as a consultant for companies that wanted to implement ethical labor practices, using his painful experience to help others avoid the mistakes he had inadvertently allowed. Ethan had taken on the responsibility of overseeing the compensation fund for Eleanor's victims, ensuring that each exploited woman received not only financial compensation but also support to rebuild their lives. You know, said Valerie one night as the whole family dined together, I still don't remember everything about the past, but I remember what matters. What do you remember? Asked Iris. I remember that love is stronger than fear. I remember that good people exist, even when bad people try to make us forget. And I remember, she looked around the table, that family isn't just about blood, it's about choice. Richard smiled, thinking about how his life had changed completely in less than a year. He had lost a fortune, a company, a wife he discovered he had never really known, but he had gained something much more valuable. He had gained a true family, built on honesty, compassion, and the determination to protect the most vulnerable. To our family, he said, raising his water glass. To our family, everyone echoed, including Iris, who added with the simple wisdom of childhood, the family we choose to have. Outside, through the dining room window, birds sang in the trees of the small garden, and for the first time in a long time, everything was exactly as it should be. A year after the formation of their new family, Richard woke up to the sound of laughter coming from the kitchen. It was a sound that still surprised him some mornings. After decades living in a house where smiles were calculated and happiness was staged, hearing genuine joy still seemed almost surreal. He went downstairs and found Iris and Valerie making pancakes, both covered in flour and laughing at some private joke. Iris, now 7 years old, had grown not only physically, but emotionally, transforming into a confident child who still carried scars, but who had learned that those scars did not define who she was. Good morning, family, said Richard, kissing both on the forehead. Daddy Richard, exclaimed Iris. She'd started calling him that naturally a few months ago, a title that moved him every time he heard it. Mum remembered how to make the special pancakes today. Valerie smiled shyly. Her recovery had been remarkable, although there were still gaps in her memory. But the most important thing, her memories of love, of values, of who she was, essentially, all that had returned. It's one of the best gifts I could receive, said Richard sincerely. Ethan came down soon after, wearing the simple suit he used for his work at the new company they had founded together. a consulting firm in ethical business practices that, ironically, was flourishing. "Big day today," he said, pouring himself some coffee. "The last family of victims receives their compensation this afternoon." Richard nodded gravely. The process of locating and compensating all the women exploited by Eleanor had taken almost 2 years, but was finally coming to an end. Of the 43 women identified as victims, 40 had been located and compensated. 2 had died years ago, in circumstances that were now being investigated as possible homicides, and 1 remained missing. "And Eleanor?" asked Valerie. "Any news about the trial?" "Next week," Richard replied. "The prosecutor said that with all the evidence we collected, a conviction is practically certain." Iris stopped eating, looking at the adults with the seriousness that still visited her when difficult subjects were discussed. "Do you think she's sorry?" It was a question they had all asked themselves at different times. Richard had visited Eleanor in prison only once, a few months ago, trying to understand how he had lived with a stranger for so many years. "I don't know if she's capable of true remorse," he said honestly. "But I know she can't hurt anyone anymore." "And that's enough," said Valerie, holding her daughter's hand. "Sometimes preventing someone from continuing to do harm is the only justice we can have." That afternoon, while Ethan finalized the last compensations, Richard received an unexpected call. It was Dr. Wagner, and his voice carried an urgency that made him worry immediately. "Richard, I need you to come to my office today. There's something important we've discovered about Iris." "Is she okay?" Richard asked, alarmed. "Physically, yes. But, well, it's better to explain in person." An hour later, the whole family was gathered in the doctor's office, Iris sitting between Valerie and Richard, holding their hands. "During our regular follow-ups," began Dr. Wagner, "I've observed something unique about Iris. Her ability to process trauma, her emotional resilience, her ability to form healthy bonds despite everything she's been through." "Is that bad?" asked Iris worriedly. "On the contrary," smiled Dr. Wagner. "It's extraordinary. Iris, you have a natural capacity for healing and adaptation that is rare. And more importantly, you have developed an empathy and understanding about human suffering that, used appropriately, could help many other children." "How so?" asked Valerie. "I'm proposing something unusual. There's an international foundation that works with children traumatized by family violence. They are looking for young ambassadors, children who have gone through similar experiences and can share their stories of recovery." Richard frowned. "You're suggesting that Iris relive her trauma publicly?" "No," said Dr. Wagner quickly. "I'm suggesting that she share her journey of healing. There's an important difference. It wouldn't be about what happened to her, but about how she overcame it, how she found a family, how she learned to trust again." Iris was silent for a long moment, processing the proposal. Finally, she looked at each member of her family. "Could I help other children who feel the way I felt?" she asked. "You could," confirmed Dr. Wagner, "but only if you want to, and only with the full support of your family." "I want to," said Iris without hesitation, "but only if Mom, Daddy Richard, and Ethan stay with me." "Always," promised Valerie. 6 months later, Richard found himself in an auditorium full of social workers, psychologists and educators from all over the country, watching his daughter give a keynote address with a passion and wisdom that belied her age. "When I was sad and scared," Iris was saying to the silent audience, "I thought I would never have a real family. But I learned that family isn't just who you're born with. Family is who chooses to stay with you." She looked at the audience, her eyes shining with confidence. "And I learned that even when very bad things happen, there can always be good people to help. We just need to have the courage to accept the help." Richard felt tears in his eyes, thinking about the incredible journey they had all been through, from a terrified child hiding behind a church to a young advocate for others in similar situations. After the presentation, They were approached by a middle-aged woman who identified herself as the director of a foster home in Phoenix. "Your daughter," she said, "touched our team deeply. We have several children who have experienced similar traumas, and I believe that hearing her story could make a real difference." "Iris decides," said Richard immediately. "She chooses when and how she wants to share her experience." "I want to go," said Iris without hesitation. "I want to meet the children." During the trip to Phoenix, Valerie confided her fears to Richard. "Sometimes I worry that we're asking too much of her, that she should just be a normal child." "She will never be a normal child," Richard replied gently. "She has been through things that have marked her forever, but maybe that's exactly what makes her special. She can use her experience for something bigger." At the foster home, Iris sat in a circle with 12 children between 5 and 10 years old, all carrying their own stories of pain and abandonment. "I know how you feel," she said simply. "I felt that way too. Scared, alone, thinking that no one would want me." "And how did you stop feeling that way?" asked a 7-year-old boy. "I found people who proved that I was wrong," said Iris. "And you will find them too. Sometimes it takes time, sometimes it hurts to wait, but someone always shows up." "How do you know?" asked a little girl. "Because," said Iris, smiling, "good people exist in the world. More good people than bad people. It's just harder to find them sometimes." Richard watched from afar, seeing his daughter plant seeds of hope in hearts that had forgotten how to dream. He thought of Eleanor, who had tried to destroy not only Valerie and Iris, but his own ability to trust in the goodness of people. But looking at Iris, surrounded by children who were hanging on her every word, he realized that Eleanor had failed completely. Instead of destroying hope, her actions had inadvertently created an advocate, a voice for the silenced, a light for those lost in the darkness. That night at the hotel, while Iris slept exhausted but satisfied, Valerie and Richard talked about the future. "She's going to want to do this for the rest of her life, isn't she?" said Valerie. "Probably," agreed Richard. "And maybe that's exactly what she was born to do." "Do you regret it?" asked Valerie. "Losing everything to save a child you didn't even know?" Richard looked at Iris sleeping, then at Valerie, then thought of Ethan at home, taking care of the company that was now helping other families. "I only regret one thing," he said finally. "What?" "Not hearing your cries sooner." Valerie held his hand, and together they remained in silence, watching the girl who had changed their lives and who was now changing the lives of other children. One story of hope at a time. 5 years had passed since that fateful day when Richard found Iris crying behind the church. The 6-year-old girl had become a 12-year-old teenager, tall for her age, with the same piercing blue eyes, but now shining with a confidence that seemed impossible years ago. On that October morning, a date that would always be special for the family, they were preparing for something none of them had imagined when it all began. Iris had been invited to speak before Congress about child protection, becoming the youngest activist to speak on the subject. "Nervous?" asked Valerie, fixing her daughter's hair in the hotel mirror in Washington, D.C. "A little," Iris admitted. "But it's good nervous. Like when you know you're going to do something important." Richard watched from afar, still marveling at the transformation not only of Iris, but of his entire family. Valerie had almost completely recovered her memory and now ran a support network for women who were victims of labor exploitation. Ethan had married a social worker he had met through the foundation's work, and together they were raising their first child. "You know," said Richard, approaching Iris, 5 years ago when I found you that day, I never imagined we'd get to this moment." "Me neither," smiled Iris. "That day, I just wanted someone to notice me. Now I have a whole family who sees me, and half the country too," added Ethan, entering the room. "The newspapers are calling you the voice of the forgotten children." Iris grimaced. "I hate when they do that. I'm not special. I just got lucky to find you guys. You are special," Valerie corrected gently. Not because of what you went through, but because of what you chose to do with it. An hour later, in the imposing auditorium of Congress, Iris took the podium before congressmen, journalists, and activists from across the country. Richard felt the same pride mixed with anxiety that he had felt at all her previous talks. But this time the audience was different. These were people who could actually change laws, create policies, protect other children. "Members of Congress," began Iris, her voice clear and firm, "my name is Iris Johnson Sterling, and I am here to talk about a child you have never met." The room became absolutely silent. This child lived hidden behind a church, holding a battered doll, thinking that the world had forgotten she existed. This child believed that she didn't deserve love because bad people had said it so many times that she began to believe it. Iris paused, looking directly at the audience. "That child was me 5 years ago, and if I am here today, it is not because I am special or brave. It's because one person decided to stop and listen to my cries." Richard felt tears in his eyes as Iris found him in the audience and smiled. "But for every child like me who is lucky enough to be found, there are hundreds who are still hidden, still crying, still waiting for someone to notice them." For the next 20 minutes, Iris spoke with an eloquence that belied her age about child protection systems, about the importance of investigating reports, about how society fails its most vulnerable members. "I'm not asking you to save all the children," she said, nearing the end of her speech. "I'm asking you to save one at a time, because one child saved can grow up and save others. One family that forms can inspire other families. One act of courage can create waves of change." When she finished, the silence lasted several seconds before exploding into applause. Richard saw congressmen wiping away tears, journalists furiously taking notes, and activists whispering among themselves with excitement. After the session, they were approached by dozens of people wanting to know more about Iris's story, about the foundation they had created, about how they could help. But the most important conversation happened when a congresswoman approached them. "Ms. Iris," she said, "your speech today will result in concrete action. I am proposing a bill to improve the investigation of cases of labor exploitation involving minors. Can I count on your support?" "Always," replied Iris without hesitation. "But with one condition." "What?" "The law needs to be named after my mother, Valerie Johnson. She was the first person who had the courage to report what was happening, even knowing the risk." Valerie covered her face with her hands, moved beyond words. "The Valerie Johnson Act for the Protection of Vulnerable Workers," said the congresswoman. "It has a good sound." That night, at the gala dinner that concluded the event, Richard found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey they had traveled. From a businessman focused only on profit to a social activist. From a man deceived by a sociopathic wife to the patriarch of a family united by genuine love. "What are you thinking about?" asked Valerie, sitting down next to him. "About Eleanor," he said honestly. "About how she tried to destroy so much and ended up creating something much more beautiful than anything she built. Do you miss the old life?" "Never," replied Richard without hesitation. "The old life was an illusion. This one is real." Iris approached them, taking off the high-heeled shoes she wasn't used to wearing yet. "Daddy, Richard. Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart." "Do you think life would have been different if Eleanor hadn't done all that? If Mom hadn't been forced to leave me?" It was a question that Richard had asked himself many times. "Probably," he said. "But maybe not better. Just different." "How so?" "Your mother and I would never have met. Ethan would never have learned about social responsibility. You would never have discovered your passion for helping other children. And hundreds of other children would never have heard your story of hope," added Valerie. Iris considered this for a moment. "So maybe bad things can lead to good things." "Not always," said Richard carefully. "But sometimes, when good people decide to turn pain into purpose, like you did with me, Like you did with us, Valerie corrected. You taught us that family is about choice, not about blood. That love can heal almost any wound. That courage can come in small packages, but make enormous differences. 2 years later, Richard was standing on the porch of his house, no longer the ostentatious mansion of before, but a welcoming home where laughter echoed regularly. Watching Iris play in the garden with her younger half-brother, Ethan's son, the foundation they had created now operated in 12 states, helping hundreds of families. The Valerie Johnson Act had been passed and was already resulting in more investigations and protections for vulnerable workers. And Iris, now 14 years old, had been accepted into a special program for young activists. "You're pensive today," observed Valerie, joining him on the porch. "Thinking about gratitude," he said, "for everything we lost, leading us to everything we gained." "And Eleanor? Do you still think about her?" "Sometimes," admitted Richard. "Not with anger, but with pity. She had so much power to do good, and she chose to do evil. While Iris, who had nothing, chose to turn her suffering into strength for others." At that moment, Iris ran up to them, holding a letter. "It arrived for me," she said, excited. "It's from one of the children at the foster home in Phoenix." She opened the letter and read aloud. "Dear Iris, my name is Pedro, and I am 8 years old. You came to talk to us last year and said that good people exist. You were right. A family adopted me last week. Thank you for giving me hope. Pedro." Iris folded the letter carefully, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "One child at a time," murmured Richard, remembering Iris's words in Congress. "One family at a time," corrected Valerie. "One act of love at a time," concluded Iris. As the sun set over Oakhaven, painting the sky with shades of gold and pink, the family that had been born from suffering but had grown in love remained on the porch, watching the children play, listening to the birds sing, and knowing that they had found something that all the money in the world could not buy. They had found each other. They had found purpose. They had found proof that even in the darkest stories, there is always the possibility of a happy ending for those courageous enough to rewrite their own narratives. And in the yellow house they now called home, where colorful drawings of birds still decorated the walls, where laughter replaced cries, where love replaced fear, the Johnson-Sterling family continued to prove every day that the best families are not born. They choose to become family. The story that had begun with the cry of an abandoned child ended with the laughter of a young woman who had transformed her pain into strength to change the world, one person at a time. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all against those who tried to destroy hope. Hope not only survived but multiplied, creating waves of change that would continue to spread long after the protagonists of this story had found their peace.